So what we're going to talk about tonight is fuel system safety, human factors. We've had some recent incidents in Arkansas, and this still is pretty much the #1 reason for engine failures and for forced landings in GA is either fuel exhaustion or fuel starvation. And that's because of a lot of different things, including some human factor stuff, mechanical. So we're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about a couple of case studies that happened here locally in Arkansas. Can everybody read that? It seems a little blurry. I think it'll work. All right, so here's our overview. All right, we'll jump right into the common types of fuel systems. I just want to get a good foundation so you know what we're talking about. I'm not talking down to you folks. I know that most of y'all have used fuel systems and y'all are well aware, but let's go ahead and build that foundation up real quick before we go into the case studies. So a gravity feed system, this is typical in like a Cessna 172, right? The wings are full of fuel and that's able to go down into the engine, common in high wing aircraft. Next would be the fuel pump system. This is more common in our low wings, right? So we have a fuel pump system that's pumping the fuel up to the engine, so there's no gravity feed. Both of these have different types of failures that could potentially happen, and some of them are in common as well. So mechanical failures on the gravity feed system. We've got the fuel tank vent blockage, right? How many of y'all keep a cover on the fuel tank vent on a 172? Show of hands, anybody? I don't see a lot of covers on those. Now typically it's on the left wing, right behind the strut. And I'm just talking about a 172, 150, yeah, the high wing Cessnas, this is all typical. At any rate, the caps are also vented. So most people, when I'm giving check rides, I ask about, well, do we have any backup vents or is that a single point of failure? Most of the fuel tanks caps themselves contain a vent as well, and that's kind of a backup, so that's good to know. Fuel contamination, of course, we have water, debris that could be in there. One thing to think about this is the design of the aircraft has there's a little bit of unusable fuel. So that unusable fuel is actually helping protect us because the debris and water tend to go down to that unusable space, and the fuel pickup isn't from the very bottom of the tank. So there's a little bit of a neat question that I asked during check rides of why do we have unusable fuel? And that's one of the reasons there. And then fuel siphoning. This is hard to see. This is if you don't have, I'm going to have a video of this here in a second. If you don't have a good seal on your fuel caps, you can actually have fuel siphoning. And that'll draw fuel out over the top of your wing. And on a high wing aircraft, that's very hard to detect because you can't see the top of your wing on, I don't think, any high wing if everything's operating normally. So that's something to have a factor there. Human factors, improper fuel management, and skipping pre-flight checks. These are going to be the common between all types of fuel systems, right? All right, next we have, oh, that was loud. Next we have the fuel pump systems. So this would be your low wing aircraft. Now we typically on like a Piper, this is really common on a Piper, we have two types of fuel pumps. We have an electric-driven fuel pump, and we have an engine-driven fuel pump. Now, all GA aircraft that I'm aware of have an integral fuel pump attached to the engine. So it's in the accessory part of the engine, and it's always going to pump fuel, right? But then in a fuel pump system, you're going to have an electrically driven fuel pump that needs to be on in certain phases of flight in some cases. Now, this is where training, we're going to talk about training later. Training is really important here because some of those fuel pumps you don't operate normally. They're only emergency pumps, and some that you do operate normally. I fly a wide variety of aircraft, and there's a lot of Piper twins, and I'm thinking of the Seneca specifically. The Seneca has a couple of extra fuel pumps that are red guarded switches. You don't use those unless you're having an emergency, and I've seen pilots take off with those normally, and they quickly return to the field because there's black smoke pouring out of the engines and they think they're about to have an engine failure. And all they're doing is they're just flooding the engine with too much fuel because they're operating a fuel pump when they shouldn't be operating the fuel pump. So improper use of fuel pump, that's definitely a problem there. As far as the mechanical issues, you also have fuel siphoning and then the failure of a fuel pump. So if a lot of, like I was flying in a charity flight last weekend and flying a Cherokee 180. And I'd always take off and land with that fuel pump on. As soon as I was at cruise, turn the fuel pump off. You don't need it for straight and level flight, but for takeoff and landing, we want to leave it on in case we have a mechanical fuel pump failure that's there to back up. All right, human factors, incorrect use of pumps, like I already talked about, and then fuel siphoning. So let's take a look at this video here. This is in a Beechcraft Bonanza. So you see how much fuel is coming out of there? That's a fuel siphoning effect. And notice that the cap is still on, right? And this is even trickier. We'll talk about it in a second, but here's the aerodynamic forces of what's happening. And I stole this from the Beechcraft Pilot Proficiency Program. Tom Turner puts on a lesson about fuel systems. If you fly Bonanza aircraft and you haven't joined ABS, the American Bonanza Society, I would highly suggest that. And they have some really good online content, including a whole lesson on fuel systems. At any rate, this is the shape of the wing, right? We all know about the low pressure, high pressure. So that low pressure that sits on top of the wing creates a siphoning force. And if the fuel cap isn't on tight enough, it will actually draw fuel out of the tank. Now, this will cause a couple of different failures and could present itself in different failure modes. So this is a look at a Beechcraft wing, kind of a simple diagram here. And the red circle, that circle is around the fuel sender and a float. So most of the fuel senders, they're float type devices. So it's a sealed piece of plastic that sits on top of the fuel. So there's more fuel, it floats on top of the fuel and indicates a higher level on the fuel quantity gauge. If it's less fuel, it goes down, right? So as you can see here, it's in a normal operation. However, right here, if we see during fuel siphoning, the same suction force that's causing the fuel to leave the fuel tank is also causing that fuel float to rise to the top of the tank. So you can see that the fuel sending float is no longer on top of the fuel. It's actually being sucked up to the top of the tank. So the way that this would present itself in the aircraft is you would have an unusually high amount of fuel indicated in that fuel tank. So not only are you siphoning fuel, you've got a fuel leak. You don't have any indication of that in the cockpit. In fact, you have the opposite indication. It looks like you're getting more fuel. So and we'll talk about this, I guess we'll talk about it now. With human factors being an issue here, a critical issue with fuel management is if you're flying an aircraft and you have unusual indications, and that means either an unusual high amount of fuel or an unusual low amount of fuel. Both of those are cause for concern, right? And thinking rationally, yeah, it might be great to assume, oh wow, I'm making fuel. Like, this is great. I've got more fuel than I started out with. What a great day. But yeah, think about that rationally. That's impossible unless you're hitting the tanker, which I'm going to assume you're not doing in a Cessna 172 or an A36. So if you see any abnormal indications, that's an issue, right, that you need to check out. I fly a lot of Bonanza aircraft. I always carry a light with me when I'm flying at night because every once in a while I'll just take the light, shine it out the window, and look at my wing just to see if I'm siphoning fuel, see any other stuff that you can't normally see during the day. Thankfully, when we're flying a low-wing aircraft, this would be really obvious. As long as you're looking outside, you can see, oh, I'm siphoning fuel. I need to land immediately. I would probably also select an opposite fuel tank. So if I'm siphoning fuel from the right tank, well, let's select the left tank and not select the one we're losing fuel out of. Now, I have had a fuel siphoning issue, and this is just a personal anecdote story. We had a 182 that had new fuel caps, and they were supposed to be extra aerodynamic, and they were just better. Of course, they cost a lot of money, and it was an STC, and then had been in the shop for like a month getting these new fuel caps installed. So they got the new fuel caps installed, and they're like, Seth, you need to go, fly the airplane down southern Arkansas. His first flight with these things on there. So I take off. About 30 minutes into the flight, I noticed that my right fuel gauge had dropped significantly. I took off with full tanks. This is the 84 gallons usable fuel in a 182. And I shouldn't have half tank, right? these fuel gauges are pretty reliable. We'll talk about fuel gauges in a little bit. But I look out there, I don't see anything, and I look behind the aircraft and I can see this stream of fuel. And I've been siphoning fuel out of that tank for about 30 minutes out of that right wing. And I wound up losing around 15 gallons of fuel out of that right wing, and just not long. I don't know exactly how long it was. Anyway, it landed. Turns out that fuel cap, it looked like it was seated, but since that was new equipment to me, it wasn't seated properly. So it took me 2 more attempts to get that thing seated where it wasn't siphoning fuel. So siphoning fuel in a high wing aircraft, big deal. Yeah, and that's a good point. On the aircraft, you will get some blue staining. If you had siphoning happen when you land, you'll see that. So if you're flying a high wing and you get lucky and you don't run out of fuel and you land, at your next fuel stop, you're up on top of the wing and you notice blue streaking, you've been siphoning fuel, right? And that leads straight into our next topic, which is fuel tanks. So there's 2 main types of fuel tanks in general aviation aircraft. There's an integral tank and there's a bladder tank. Let's talk about the bladder tank first. First of all, why we use bladders is it's a flexible material and it can conform to different shapes of wings, and we don't have to make the wings fuel tight, essentially. That's a good thing. So we can make a bladder, but that's going to add weight, and it also adds some types of failure modes. And what I mean by that is, imagine you've got this bladder sitting in your wing. If it loses its shape, it's not going to hold the same amount of fuel. Right? If you take an aluminum can and you crush it, you can't put as much fluid in that can anymore because it's crushed. So they usually put some sort of fasteners that fasten this bladder to conform to the inside of your wing. Well, during a siphoning incident or siphoning event, it draws a suction onto the tank, and it can cause those bladders to collapse. And it can either fully collapse or partially collapse, and it may go unnoticed. And the way it would go unnoticed is you go to your next fuel stop and you fill up the tank. And if you're not careful about keeping your fuel log and knowing how much fuel you should put in there, all you're going to see is that the tank's full, right? We fill it up until some of it spills out over the wing usually when I'm refueling, and the fuel pops out of the top. We're like, okay, tanks are full. Well, if that's a 20-gallon tank that has experienced a siphoning event and part of the tank has collapsed, it might only be a 15-gallon tank now, maybe only a 10-gallon, maybe only a 5-gallon tank. You don't really know. It depends on how that bladder has failed. So for bladder tanks, the flexible bags inside the wing, that's what we have on a lot of GA aircraft. And then the next one is the wet wing. So the wet wing, these are sealed portions of the wing structure. So this is an actual wet wing. I believe the Mooney has a wet wing. That's probably one of the most common. You're a Mooney guy. They have that, right? So a lot less, I guess they could collapse, right? But then you've got a bigger issue. Your wing has collapsed if your fuel tank has collapsed. So you probably noticed that. But they have another issue of they can actually leak maybe a little bit easier, because now the structure of the wing itself has to be sealed in a way that the fuel is not able to leak out. So usually there's some sort of sealant material that's glued or painted on the seams of the wings. So you can imagine kind of the inside of the wing with all the ribs and aluminum and stuff. So that can degrade over time and cause fuel leaks. So since Mooney is real common here, it's really important to do an under the wing inspection. So when you're pre-flighting the airplane, getting on your hands and knees, getting your hands and knees a little dirty, looking under the aircraft to see any blue streaking under the wing, that could be indicative. You're going to see that blue streaking, and that could be indicative of a fuel leak, or it is. One of the reasons why we have that blue dye in aviation grade fuel is to help us identify leaks, actually. And I've had it help me on a couple of different instances. One time on an engine of a Seneca, we popped the cowl on the engine of the Seneca, and I noticed around the intake tubes there was a lot of blue streaking. So that was indicative of, hey, we've got an intake leak here. And the fuel air mixture going into the engine is actually getting blown out onto the outside of the engine. We've got a fuel leak there. And then several times on the lower portion of the wing or the upper portion of the wing, you'll see the blue streaking. I was just doing a check ride probably 2 months ago, and a gentleman showed up with a 172. We go out and do the pre-flight, and the right-hand side of the plane, there's just blue dye. It looked like he murdered a Smurf on the outside of the plane. And I was like, what's the issue here? And he's like, oh, the mechanic told me not to worry about it. This is a normal leak. No, it's not a normal leak. All right, these save weight, capacity. Obviously, we don't have that bladder in there, so there are some upsides there. So bladder tank failure modes. You lose shape or collapse and may cause inaccurate fuel readings. So remember those fuel floats we were talking about? Again, if the bottom, depending on how the failure happens of the fasteners, I've seen it to where the bladders have actually pushed up on the fuel sending units, or they keep the sending unit from going all the way to the bottom of the tank. So what could be happening is that fuel sending unit is telling you have half tanks, when really it's just, there's an obstruction in the fuel bladder itself from reaching the bottom of the tank, so it can't tell you the true amount of fuel anymore. So that would cause your inaccurate fuel readings. All right, detection and prevention. The main thing is we have to track our fuel usage, and this is what I see a lot of pilots not doing. And this isn't one of my official NTSB case studies, but there was a recent event with a plane that I'm very familiar with. It's a Beechcraft Travel Air, and it has main tanks and aux tanks. It's a 4-position switch, and you can either go main, aux, crossfeed, or off. Those are your 4 options. Well, the POH says you need to take off and land in the mains, and when you're cruising straight and level flight, you can burn off the auxes. So it's typical, you have it straightforward for the mains, you take off, as soon as you level off, you select the auxes and you burn out of the auxes. When you land, you take it back to the mains. So this plane had been flying several iterations where the pilot thought he was doing this. But because of some poor maintenance along the line, we don't exactly know where this happened, that fuel selector was no longer working. Meaning when he would select aux tank, he wasn't selecting aux tank. He was still burning out of the main. And then he would go and select the main and land. And luckily, all of his flights were within the range of the fuel capacity of the main tanks only. Well, as luck would have it, or unluckiness would have it, he's flying and he flies beyond the range of the main tanks. So he experiences a fuel starvation event, not exhaustion. Right? Exhaustion is when you totally run out of fuel in the whole airplane. Starvation just means there's fuel on the airplane, it's just not getting to the engine. So he had a fuel starvation event in, I think it was the left engine first. So he selected what he thought was another tank, and the whole time he wasn't doing anything. All that he was doing is burning off the mains. The other engine quickly experienced fuel starvation, so now he has a dual engine failure in a twin, something that is not very common at all. We don't really practice for. Luckily, there was a really high SA pilot in the air nearby that said, hey, to your 10 o'clock, there's a grass strip. Talked his eyes to this grass strip, he's able to put it down. They got gas back in the plane, flew it out shortly thereafter, after discovering the problem with the fuel selectors themselves. So it's kind of a crazy story. It happened here in Arkansas not too long ago. But how could this pilot have avoided this, right? It was a mechanical failure. We know that those fuel selectors weren't operating correctly. Well, the pilot also wasn't overseeing, and I don't think he was the pilot each flight, but whoever was flying the plane wasn't overseeing the refueling. They were just paying the bill. Hey, top it off. Go inside, have a cup of coffee. Who's done that? I've done that. I'll raise my hand. I've done it. Several times I've asked a lineman that I don't know from Adam. Not you, Adam. Adam, I don't know. I've asked the lineman to refill the plane, and I don't oversee it. Now, I'm pretty good about looking at the fuel receipt and making sure that around about the amount of fuel I thought was going to go in the plane went in the plane. And we kind of know that just for how much it hurts whenever we swipe the credit card anyway. So that's what this pilot was doing, and the plane wasn't using more fuel than normal. It was just only using the fuel out of one tank, and the line guy wasn't saying, hey, I put 40 gallons in the mains. He was just saying, oh, I put 40 gallons in there. And the pilot was completely unaware that he was came within 5 gallons of running out of fuel on a couple of those refuels. If he would have gotten out and checked, the auxes were full the whole time. The auxes never burned down. So he could have caught that. It was a preventable incident in that if he would have checked after each flight, hey, I have burned fuel out of the auxes. That would have been able to see that. The other thing, that there's a human factor issue with this incident specifically, is that this was an older 50s model Travelair. So it only has 2 fuel gauges. It has 4 tanks. It only has 2 gauges. And those gauges on most of the Travelairs are not correlated with the tank selector. But in another aircraft that this pilot flew, they are. So in a Cessna 310, when you move the fuel selector, the fuel gauges automatically show what the selector's pointing at. In the Travelair, they do not. You have to switch the fuel selector and switch the fuel tank. So that right there is another human factors issue where we've got a negative transfer. The majority of the twin time that this pilot was flying was in a different type that operated similar, but fundamentally different. So that's a little anecdote there. All right, wet wing failure modes. We got sealant degradation. We can have structural cracks. Hopefully structural cracks, that means your airframe is cracked. So you've got a bigger issue there. So we need to visually inspect for leaks and then the structural monitoring. With the advent of borescope cameras, or just cameras in general that are easy to get into hard spaces, it's, of course, talk with a knowledgeable AMT about how you safely put an electronic device in a fuel tank. Don't go do this yourself. But it's much easier to go in and inspect the fuel bladder or a wet wing to see if there's any deformations or anything that needs to be addressed. All right, fuel gauge. Let's talk about fuel gauges. Common misconception. Who's heard that fuel gauges only need to be accurate when they're empty? I've heard it. I heard it for a long time. That's just not the case. So gauges, they have to be accurate throughout the entire range of the fuel tanks. And we could go down the rabbit hole about the Part 23 certification and how that changed. And I think 2017 is when the old rules went away. But really 91205, or that dreaded tomato flames acronym I hate. But the 91205 says the fuel gauge indicating the quantity of fuel in each tank. That's pretty black and white. The fuel gauge has to identify the quantity in that tank. 91205 doesn't say identify when the tank is empty. It says identify the quantity. So the fuel gauges have to work. If your fuel gauges aren't working properly, and you know who you are, I know you, I've flown airplanes where I'm like, there's no way this gauge is working right. But yeah, if your gauges aren't working right, the FAA is laughing at me, that's great. But yeah, if they're not working right, have that addressed. Figure out why. Do you have a bad fuel sending unit? There's companies that overhaul sending units. You can have new gauges installed. Just try to track down what's wrong with your fuel quantity indicator. But don't just accept. This myth, I think, makes people take fuel quantity gauges less seriously. If they don't work, they're like, oh, it only has to be accurate when it's empty anyway. Like I've heard that exact line from many pilots. And it's just like, well, we're just accepting that fuel gauges don't work. And yeah, in a 40, 50, 80-year-old airplane, maybe they need to be looked at, right? All right, accurate fuel gauges. So obviously, this can really help prevent fuel starvation events. And we can see that by general aviation has gotten safer as time has gone on. Part of it is I think we have better training, despite what some people think. I really do think the training has gotten better. The other thing is mechanically, the planes have gotten better just with the advent of technology. So you can go out and fly an older 50s, 60s model 172 that has really bad fuel gauges. I call them low resolution displays because they're about an inch and a half wide. And that inch and a half is showing me the difference between, 0 gallons and 20 gallons. Versus I fly a newer 172 G1000 high resolution display is very accurate, and it also has lights. So at a certain point, I'll get a fuel low light. I should have looked this up. Now I just remembered it, but there was a statistic that I've seen recently of the number of fuel starvation and fuel exhaustion events that have happened in old Cessnas versus the new Cessnas that have a low fuel light. And it was a drastic difference, as you can imagine. A lot less likely to have a fuel starvation incident when you have a light that comes on that you can't turn off, that's blaring you in the face saying low fuel when you get down to about 30 minutes of usable fuel. That's a really important safety feature. And that's also in the SR-22, the Cirrus, the SR-20. I think all new build GA aircraft have some sort of fuel low light that will come on in addition to those fuel gauges. So your responsibility is to keep track of those fuel gauges and make sure that it makes sense, right? We probably get a little lazy after we get our private pilot and our commercial pilot about keeping fuel logs. That may become a lot more important as you go on in your career. If you're going to go fly for the airlines, for instance, myself, I just did an ETOPS flight to Hawaii. And during that flight, about every 15 minutes, we're really looking at our fuel down to the 10th of the pound to make sure we have as much fuel as we thought we would have. And we're keeping a very close track of our fuel log. One, to make sure, obviously, we're going to make it to our destination safely. The second reason is I fly for Southwest, like I said. Both Southwest and I think Delta have had recent incidents where there was a fuel leak discovered. So we have a point at our route, a flight called the equal time point. And that's kind of, okay, do we have to turn around and divert back to San Francisco, or can we continue on to the islands? And in both of those instances, especially ours, we got really close to that equal time point and then discovered we've got a fuel leak. And this, I say we as in the company, it wasn't me, thankfully. But they got near that ETP, realized they have a fuel leak, and the reason they were able to identify that fuel leak is because they were keeping very close track of their fuel quantity gauges. Now, it's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison saying of the type of fuel gauges we have in a 737 versus what you have in a 172, but I use that to illustrate the point that monitoring your fuel gauges and having that expected amount in there based on what those readings are is really important. And I think that, again, that gets overlooked because of this myth that the fuel gauges aren't accurate anyway unless they're empty. All right, fuel selectors. This is a big one. And there's some human factors folks here from the FAA. Y'all like general human factors or specifically? Yeah. Human factors fascinates me because, again, I'm in a lot of different aircraft. And in older aircraft, the way they look was really important, right? You have to fly an old H-35 Bonanza that has the piano keys, and man, it's Art Deco beautiful. But the gear switch looks identical to the landing lights. It looks great. It's a human factors nightmare. And then you get an SR-22, a Gen 6 SR-22 is like a human factors miracle. It's like, I sit in that thing and just everything's where it's supposed to be. It's the easiest plane to fly, I think. And it's because they've put a lot of thought into human factors. Oddly enough, Cessna in their 300 and 400 series twins didn't put much thought into human factors. And I feel like the way I feel flying a 400 series Cessna single pilot IFR is like those guys in New York, the one-man band guys, that like have the drum and the horn and they're trying to do everything. That's what I feel like flying a 400 series Cessna because it's a human factors nightmare. You got I got switches over here I can barely reach with the shoulder harness on that are really important. They're fuel related. So to top it all off, there's no standardization in fuel selectors. And so I was thinking, what's a good analogy here? And I'm in a lot of hotels, and I ran into this last week on a Southwest trip. This is like your familiar control, right? If I tell you to go operate a shower and you see this is easy, right? I know everybody knows how this works. This is standard equipment in like 90% of hotels. We stay in a nice hotel, and this is what's in the bathroom. It took me like 20 minutes to figure out how to take a shower with this thing. Because, yeah, it looks great. It's really cool, futuristic looking. I have no idea like how to operate this thing without getting some training on it or with some trial and error. And so that's a great analogy, because that's exactly how I feel when I see this in a Cessna. I'm like, okay, both. Easy, right? Pre-flight, both, done. Now, as an instructor, I was thinking about this. There's something called the law of primacy. So the law of primacy just basically says the first way you learn something is kind of the first impressions rule, right? The first impressions really matter. Law of primacy, same thing. The first thing you learn is what's the most indelible. So we have all these pilots that are learning on this fuel selector right here, both. It's the easy button, both. They're not even thinking about switching tanks. So then they go to fly something like this. Now, this is from a Bonanza. We're actually going to talk about one of our case studies from an M35 Bonanza that has a fuel selector like this. Now, basically it's the same, right? I'm selecting different tanks with it. I have a couple different options here. I have a left and a right. I have some instructions on there. It's kind of worn off. If you look in the pilot operating handbook, it says, hey, that's a required placard. I don't know if the FAA would be okay with that, because you can't really read it. But anyway, it's telling us that, hey, we have to use the left main first, and then we can use the right. The first hour, we need to use the left main, because any extra fuel goes back into the left main that we don't burn. So if we start out with the right tank, we'll be dumping fuel overboard. So obviously, I already am at the point where we don't have the easy button. This takes a little bit of training to use properly, and you're going to have to actively manipulate it during flight. But the pilots that are flying this learned in a 172 that have the fuel selector both. So that's one of the things that's different. The other thing you may not have caught on, but look at the shape of that handle. So the 172 has a long piece of the handle points to the tank that you have selected. The long one is opposite of the tank that you have selected. So even from a human factor standpoint, there's no standardization in how these fuel selector works. And this is actually the second anecdote I'll share with you. And the reason the Travel Air and the Twin Navion I'm fixing to talk about, I don't have the NTSB stuff for. The preliminary is all that's out there. So this is all just anecdotal evidence for me. I've got final reports for 2 other fatal accidents. The 2 that I'm sharing with you now were non-fatal, but they happened in this state, and they happened in the past year, within the past 12 months. So the Twin Navion, the reason that happened is because of this. The long handle, the pilot thought the long part of the handle was pointed at the tank he has selected. And it wasn't. It was opposite. There was a tiny arrow on the other end of the handle, like right here. So when he thought he was on the main tanks, he was actually on the auxiliary tanks. And the auxiliary tanks are much smaller. And it's a similar story to the Travel Air story, is he just had gotten lucky. For several flights, he had been burning off of the auxes and nothing bad had happened. And then one day he flew a little bit longer than he normally flew. And he starved those fuel tanks of fuel and had a fuel starvation incident. So he had fuel on the airplane. He just had the selector in the wrong position. And the reason he had the fuel selector in the wrong position is he was misunderstanding what that fuel selector was doing. So he was having the same problem I was having when I was trying to take a shower last week, but the consequences were a lot higher than just getting burned. Luckily, serious injuries, but he was able to, he and his passengers were able to make it out. So these are some examples of some unfamiliar controls. You can tell the one up to the top right, that plane, that's from an NTSB docket. So that was a fatal accident. And you can tell there, I've got two sets of pumps, right? We talked about a fuel pump system. We have aux pumps, but then we also have fuel transfer pumps. So flying more complex planes, specifically twins, but there are some singles that have this. The picture on the top left there, that's from a Beechcraft. That's a DeShannon tip tank mod that's very common on Beechcraft. So if I have an aftermarket DeShannon tip tank on a M35 Bonanza, my engine can't feed directly from those tip tanks. All I can do is transfer the tip tanks into the main tanks. So now I have to burn the main tanks down for an hour or two, and then turn my transfer pumps on to fill those tanks back up. And it's not uncommon to have 1 or 2 fuel gauges on the plane and have 7 tanks of fuel. I've got 1 fuel gauge and 7 tanks. That starts sounding like that one-man band, right? You're doing a lot of stuff, a lot of tracking to keep track of this. And I think this played a direct role in one of the case studies that we're about to talk about. The lower one, this is from a Cessna 310. So this played, I think, a role in our Travel Air story where everything turned out great. But those tanks, as I switch those fuel selectors, they automatically make my fuel gauges switch and read what's in that tank. That's unlike the other planes. All right, so we're going to talk about some case studies here, but pilots selecting the wrong tank. Fuel starvation is just, hey, there's fuel on board and we can't get to it. The key here is thorough training in that aircraft. You need to get thorough training from an instructor that's familiar with that airplane. Because the way the FARs are worded, and the way we can use those is, I can go out, hey, my CFI buddy that I get all my checkouts from, he's got a couple hours in this plane, so he can give me a sign-off, and he's good to go. Well, the problem is, if that CFI buddy of yours has only operated that plane in the pattern doing checkouts, he probably hasn't used the fuel system that much. Right? There was I used to have a multi-engine course in Russellville. People would come from all over the country to learn how to fly multis, and we flew Travel Airs. And a guy had heard about us through the American Bonanza Society, and he had flown his M35 Bonanza from Washington State to Russellville, Arkansas in one leg.